Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the next in the series of the ISE's webinars. I'll be doing this one today, and we'll be talking about how employers are responding to the coronavirus crisis, and also the steps that employers can take to mitigate the issues that are arising from the situation. I'll be calling on a few bits of evidence. Some will be the survey that we pushed out a couple of weeks ago. Some of you will be engaged in the employer town halls that we're running via Zoom meetings at the moment, so we've got some feedback coming through from those, and some of it is experience gleaned from people who've dealt with economic crashes in the past and actually how employers have tackled those situations. So hopefully this session will be a mixture of a bit of scenario setting in terms of what's happening at the moment and a bit of guidance on terms of actually how you might be able to deal with some of the situations as they evolve. What we'll do with questions in the webinar, I've got roughly probably about 30 minutes of content. If you've got questions, please use the questions tool within the webinar software. I won't answer questions as I go along because it's quite difficult to keep track of. But what I'll do at the end of it is I'll address any questions that have been raised as we go along the way. This webinar is recorded, so if you want to come back to it at a later stage, you can do, or if you want to pass it around to other people, to team members, they will also be able to view the recording. What we've also done is actually pull together a more detailed response guide than we'll cover in this session, and that is now available online. And I've got a link to that at the end of the section. It's in the research section, in the published report section on our website. So, but don't worry about that. I'll give you some links to the end of it. So we've got 93 people joined at the moment, and more coming online. So I think we shall get cracking now. So where are we at the moment? This is obviously an unusual time in the cycle, something that we didn't expect at all. So if you look at the headlines, I think we all know the situation at the moment. We have, organisations that were in a precarious position already, have gone either into administration or have gone bust. So we've already had Flybe Airlines, car loot shows, along with other restaurant groups going into administration. The property market is pretty much frozen. The impact on the stock markets is well documented. So we can't deny the economic impact of this crisis. And I guess in terms of our market, that's the nuts and bolts of what will affect us most. What will happen with employers? How will they manage their student intakes, those joining or their future recruits sort of through the rest of this year? And we will be covering that on this webinar. But I don't think we should forget, actually, in all this, this is obviously a very, very human crisis as well. We see about the stories coming through the press every day, and I don't think we should forget that actually there are people that we know, people we work with, who will have people who are personally affected by this crisis, and I don't think we should forget that at all. And also, as we talk about actually all the uncertainties in the market, of course, the students that are out there, and actually the impact this may be having on them at this particular time. One of the other images I put on here is actually around what's happened in the broader recruitment market. And the graph on the bottom left-hand side shows actually what's happened to job postings as coronavirus cases have increased, and you can see a real significant drop off there in the number of advertised job postings, a real fall off. I think if any of you work with anybody who works in the sort of the recruitment agency side of the business, I was on a call this morning and hearing about people being furloughed and businesses really not being able to do very much. But I think one thing we should remember throughout this as well is that there are employers still recruiting. I'll come on to this a bit later. We know of ISE members who are out there recruiting. We know of other areas that are recruiting, other sectors in the economy. So I think one of the things that we all should remember, as we do always with our labour market data, is that actually there's a danger that we overgeneralise and assume that everybody's in the same bucket. Tristan will be doing an update webinar later this week. This is the first of 2 webinars we're doing this week. But I think some of you will probably have been on the webinar he did last week, where he highlighted the results of the very first survey we put out there. We're currently working on the next survey, which we will do at some point after Easter, to see actually how the situation's changed and to get more detail on actually what's happening out there in the market. But the first thing people asked about really is what's actually happening with graduate vacancies. So remember, this survey was done really as we were entering that lockdown phase, and this is based on initial reactions of employers. And already at that point, 27% of employers were saying they would recruit less graduates this year. 23% they'd be recruiting less apprentices, so not quite a bigger drop off in the apprentice market. But also remember, when you're talking about ISE level of vacancies, apprentices, non-graduate vacancies account for roughly a quarter to a third of all the vacancies that we report on. I think this number's changed really on the interns piece, and also it's a little bit masked by actually people who are changing their intern programs, and actually what they're doing now, actually you might not term apprenticeships or work placements, but I'll come on to that very shortly. But obviously that's one of the areas that was affected very quickly. As I said, there are many employers who are still out there recruiting, and actually we've seen a considerable shift in terms of recruitment activities being now put online. So at this point in time, we had 60% of our respondents had moved their assessment centres online, and 71% moving interviews online. Again, I'll come on to this a bit later, but we now have employers who are taking candidates all the way through the selection process and actually making job offers in the virtual space for people to join later in the year. Another thing we're doing some work on at the moment is trying to understand what's happening with the cancellation of exams. So obviously GCSEs and A levels are going to be cancelled. Ofqual have already issued some guidance in terms of how those grades will be awarded, but actually we're expecting to see a bit more detail come out by the end of this month. And also, of course, universities. So I think something that employers aren't always aware of is that universities, being autonomous institutions, actually they determine their own methods of both grading students and also how and when those grades will be published. So we've been doing a little bit of work with that was started by My Kind of Future. We're also putting AGCAS into this, but over the next couple of weeks we want to get some information out to you so that you can look at university by university to understand what they will be doing. Of course, students are affected very differently by this. So if you're doing a subject that's very text heavy, classroom based, actually that can be moved quite easily online. If you're doing a degree that's more practically based, it might be a science degree. You might be like my niece, she's doing a fashion degree. She should be, producing everything for a graduation show. And of course, that's all on hold. So there's the real tricky sort of very issues there that universities have to deal with. And this final figure, again, I think that reflects the time this survey was done. There's nothing obviously happening on campus at the moment with employers visiting universities. We're starting to hear employers ask questions around actually what's going to happen in the autumn term. Are there going to be more virtual opportunities? When can they start booking autumn events? All that kind of stuff. I think it's a little bit early yet for us to do detailed work on that, but I think over the coming weeks we will start to producing more information for you in terms of actually what people are doing and how can you adjust your strategies to deal with the fallout from the coronavirus crisis and what the new difference might look like later in the year. So this is a bit more detail in terms of those hiring graduates. When we say non-graduates, really we're talking about apprentices. There are some programs out there that are similar to apprentice programs but aren't actually called apprentice programs because they're not funded by the levy. At this time, it's worth pointing out that actually a considerable number of employers actually didn't know what they'll be doing, and I think that still is the case. When we're talking about September start dates, and when I talk to employers, many of them are still trying to work out actually what they need to do and actually what what their businesses will need. Having said that, we do know some employers who have stopped recruiting. We know of some employers who've already shifted start dates, so they've got candidates who should have been joining in September who will now be starting in June. But I know of an employer who they have a spring intake, and they started new graduates only last week and found ways to actually be able to start them virtually and do virtual onboarding. So real mixture out there. And also of those that do know what they're doing, actually there are a considerable number still hiring as planned. As I said at the start, we mustn't forget that actually there are employers still active in this space. And I think that's a message that we need to work quite hard to get out to students, because if I reflect back on the financial crisis, one of the challenges for employers was that employers are still recruiting, but actually students read, the sort of the bad headlines and assume very much that employers had shut up shop. So I think it's quite important that we give students practical advice in terms of how they can keep their employability activities up, but also, be flexible and be out there in the job market for those vacancies that do exist. But of course, there are a small number of employers that have actually already started to decrease their intakes. You can imagine the kind of businesses we're talking about, those in the travel sector, in the hospitality sector. We've got a pretty broad range of members within the ISE, and some of those businesses, for obvious reasons, are having to take quite drastic action. As I said at the start, we'll be doing another survey just after Easter, where we expect to get an update on those figures, but hopefully also start to get an idea of actually the numbers of vacancies that are being affected. But let me talk first of all about work experience and internships. There's kind of two main sections to this webinar. The first is around the work experience type places and internships, and the second is actually about graduate hiring numbers, before we conclude with some overall recommendations. But let's talk about work experience and internships at the moment. I think it's pretty clear that the spring weeks for Easter were cancelled very quickly, again for obvious reasons, so that had to happen quite fast. But employers are thinking about the summer and are facing a couple of challenges. One is the uncertainty actually around how long lockdown will last, but the other is, even as we start to get movement back, actually will organisations be really in any shape to actually give a good experience to interns or placement students who might be coming into the business? So we're doing a number of town halls by sector for employers. They replace the sector focus groups you do at the moment. So if you're an employer and you're not signed up to those, please do join those. We're getting very strong attendance and some really good, healthy conversations with people sharing ideas, asking questions of those that have put in place some of the initiatives we're talking about, and actually a lot of sort of working together to come through with various solutions. But here's what some of the feedback that we've captured, what's happening around actually the whole internship place. So of course, most Easter placement schemes have already been cancelled, and some summer placements have been cancelled, either because the business is actually going to be significantly affected, or like I said, because actually employers don't think they'll be able to give candidates a very good experience. So we're hearing that employers are seeking to shorten placements, also move them online, or offer some kind of alternative experiences. And that's, I think, where we're going to see some of the interesting innovation coming through here. So we're hearing of employers who are able to maybe offer work-based projects online that groups of students can work together on collaboratively. We're hearing employers who are putting some of their learning and development sessions actually online and getting students to work through those. So a whole range of different initiatives. I mean, there was one employer on our finance town hall last week that is still planning to bring in all its interns, well, not bring them into the office, but still have all their intern students go through an 8-week program, which will be a mixture of projects and learning and development sessions that they will be accredited for and paid for. The final point on here that employers are saying to us is around the whole apprentice piece. and actually how best to work with training providers on those. That's something that we're doing some work on right now, actually, because the apprentice piece obviously is more complicated. What can you actually do with the apprentices? How does the levy impact it? I think that's going to take a little bit longer to unpack. So we will get more on that for you in the very near future. So actually, what can employers do around work experience and internship programs? So are there projects that you as an employer can deliver remotely? You know, are there case studies that you could give to students that could work on working in groups? We've got a webinar in the pipeline that should be coming up the week after next, actually, with University of York, where we'll be actually looking at, is there any learnings that we can get from higher education who are actually used to delivering a lot of this kind of stuff online and various projects. So there are opportunities to do that and very different ways to do that, and employers are working quite hard at doing that. The other thing I already mentioned is delivering a range of skill-based training programs online. So I've been talking to some students who some employers who recognize they're not going to be offering internship programs as such, but they can actually offer training courses over a shorter period. And actually what they're looking at doing is grouping those together and then giving some form of recognition off to students who complete all those activities. And that might actually lead to some kind of next step in the selection process when recruitment gets back to normal. Of course, recognizing that the internship programs are very, very, very powerful feeder programs for future intakes. Is there a way of connecting interns with a mentor in the organisation? You know, those programs can still run because actually sometimes they run virtually anyway. So actually maybe that's a way of providing interns or people who would have been interns actually with insights into the organisation, even if a full internship can't be run. And this final point, actually, if as an employer you've already got existing relationship with specific universities, if you're partnering with academics, well, actually, is there any way that that can be ramped up to deliver online projects or employability skills program? Universities are working very hard at the moment, actually, to shift a lot of their learning online, because of course students are having to still continue their studies, but do that remotely. So I think there's lots of learnings that can be had from institutions and lots of opportunities for partnership there as well. So quite a lot happening in that space at the moment. These are some of the options, question and answers, again, that we've had come through some of our conversations with employers and some of the questions that we're hearing asked at Town Hall. So obviously there's the question of payment. Should interns have compensation if their program's cancelled or adjusted? And again, we're hearing a mixed bag of responses. I've already mentioned the employer in the financial services sector that's got their interns still on an 8-week program and is going to pay them just as they normally would. We've heard of employers who have had to cancel their intern programs, but they've agreed to pay the students the notice period that was written into those intern contracts. And then a whole range of kind of options in between those that is largely being driven by actually what program you provide in place of that internship program. I think it's also important that if you're as an employer, you talk to your HR contacts, your employee relations teams, employment lawyers to understand actually what the contractual obligations are here. So you've also got that side of things covered as well. And we've heard of some employers saying that actually, well, we can't actually do anything in the foreseeable future this year, but actually, can we defer our internship programs? So we've heard of some employers who are actually shifting their intern programs into a shorter program that will happen over the Christmas period, or others have offered the opportunity to get some work experience in Easter. Summertime next year is a little bit tricky, although we have heard some employers talk about it, because of course the majority of employers offer their programs to penultimate year students, and they're the students who will be graduating next year and looking for work in next year's job market. And what should alternative programs be called? So again, we're having this question. So should an employer actually still call something internship or a work experience program if actually that's not really what it is? If it's some different form of online experience. So we're hearing programs actually calling programs something that reflects, you know, a learning experience theme. So recognizing that it is quite a different experiences. And then how do we recognise the students that we've already selected for internships, even if the internships do not run? So actually, if candidates have already been through some form of selection process to get on the intern programme, actually we're hearing employers saying, right, we can't run the selection programme, but once recruitment gets back up to speed, we will give you a fast track opportunity. So maybe you just need to come into the final stage. So that's some of the sort of the questions that we're hearing employers ask, and those are some of the solutions coming from employers that have already sort of thought this through and have moved a bit further down the line on it. So that's on the student hiring piece. Just a reminder, as I said at the start, if you've got any questions that come from this, please put it into the question box that's part of the software we're using, and I'll come to them at the end. But the next bit I want to move on to is actually talking about student hiring for 2020. What is going to happen with graduate vacancies this year? The two graphs that you can see in front of you were produced by Tristram when he did our mid-year pulse survey, which we launched in January, mid-January, which seems like an absolute lifetime ago now. I won't talk through all the detail, but basically what this was showing was that actually the student market was pretty flat this year. So 3% growth in graduate vacancies, 2% growth in apprentice school leaver vacancies. Now that's not very high growth. Remember, this data was being collected around the time of the general election that we had, and in the aftermath of that. So it could well at that time have reflected a note of caution amongst employers. But we were predicting a flat market anyway, because what typically happens at this time of year is that employers' recruitment targets can often be just a little bit over ambitious. Either employers don't need all the vacancies they thought they would at the start of the year, or actually there's various difficulties that come in the way that mean the businesses don't need quite so many. And I very much remember at the survey launch, Tristram presenting this data and saying that obviously this data doesn't account anything like, you know, an economic shock to the system. And at the time, he was thinking about the fallout from Brexit, not coronavirus, but very much that is the shock to the system that we are now living through. So I think it's too early to say what is actually going to happen with graduate vacancies, but I don't think there's any sugarcoating of this. I think it's pretty clear they're going to be a smaller number of jobs this year than there were last year. By how much, it's too early to say, and we will keep a very close eye on that as those plans start to be formulated by employers and when we can get that data out. But as I said, some employers are also recruiting. So this is a summary of some of the issues that have been discussed on our town halls. So we have experience of employers who've successfully transferred their recruitment processes online. Video interviews, telephone interviews were pretty common in our industry anyway. So actually that's not necessarily a significant challenge to upscale to that kind of activity. But actually online assessment centres, that end of the process being done virtually is very much new territory. And we've seen lots of employers adapting to tools that are out there. So using tools like Zoom to actually accommodate activities online, and I'll talk through another couple of slides actually what that might look like. Obviously, lots of employers talking about the importance of keeping warm activities. So if you've got candidates out there that you've offered, they're going to be starting in September, actually establishing, it's even more important than usual around establishing those online communities and staying in touch with those students. Again, I'm going to come on to the communication bit shortly, because I think it's very important that as employers you get that piece right, because understandably students are concerned about having a job offer, they will be reading the press. So as an employer, it's really important that you communicate with that group of students and let them know what's happening, even if it's good news, because when there's a vacuum of information, often people assume the worst. But most employers that we deal with are still hoping and expecting to start a new cohort of recruits in September. Whereas some have revised some of those numbers downwards, others are seeking to maintain their intakes, or as I said, in some cases, increase them. So what's happening with those that actually are continuing hiring? Well, here's what we're seeing. So as I said, we're seeing that increased usage of using web-based tools, so video interviewing platform, Skype interviews. You might use the pre-recorded type technology, so which a number of our supplier members offers. So actually, the interview piece very much able to use. And then using web tools to deliver your assessment exercises. So there are lots of employers that have been able to adapt those exercises they use and actually deliver them by a web-based tool. And also increase that range of online assessment tools. So if there's something that you might use in an assessment centre but can't use anymore, well, actually, is there something that you can use that might give you the same results, but actually it's a different assessment centre tool? So our advice to employers is work very closely with your providers in this space, around those that deliver those tests for you, those that have helped you build your recruitment process. If you go onto the ISE website, there are a number of previous webinars that we've had already that are actually talking about some of this stuff to give you more detail on that. So we are hearing about employers who are using Zoom and similar tools to conduct group activities online. It does require careful management. 2 recruiters, with one focused on maybe the technical issues and another on running the group. We've heard of people using Zoom and setting up different rooms within Zoom and moving candidates to and fro. We know of some employers who are able to do role play exercises via tools like Zoom, and some who actually are enabling. It's not quite group work, but it is enabling a small number of students to actually work on the same exercise. Of course, ground rules need to be carefully set. It's a different experience for you as employers, but also it's a very different experience for students and what they might be expecting. So some employers are offering practice calls, test setups to actually get people used to using with the technology. And the feedback we're getting is that most are working with groups of students, around 6 students at a time in this process. So that way it can be administrated effectively. Again, as we start to get more evidence around how employers are doing this, we will collate more of that information, and we're looking over the next few weeks to publish sort of some how-to guides and some of the pros and cons of these exercises. But of course, there are some of you out there who have got to face the reality of having to manage down intakes. I talked at the start of this about the economic impact on employers, and that can't be avoided. I know from my own experience, those that know me, I used to run graduate recruitment at EY. So I was doing that through the financial crash. I was at PwC when the dot-com bubble burst, and I was working in retail during, this is how old I am, going back to the early 90s in the recession then, when the phrase negative equity was very common language as the housing market crashed. So, and I think there's some evidence that we can use from those times to understand how employers that have to face these kind of difficult decision is how to do it properly. And I think some of the questions that you need to be asking if this is the situation is, are there other areas in the business where candidates can be offered roles? One of the messages that we give to students when we're asked at times like this is actually that need to be flexible. And that's to say to students, you might not be able to get your preferred job in exactly the area you wanted to, but are there other options close by? And I think that's the same within your organisations. Are there either temporary non-graduate roles that are rising that people might be able to do for a period of time, or have you got bits of the business that actually are highly in demand at the moment because of the change in circumstances that can make up for those areas that may be suffering at the moment? So very much taking that whole business view of the situation. Is it possible to offer candidates due to start this autumn the option to start in 2021, deferring positions to a year's time? We're all very hopeful. I'm sure that we'll be in a very, very different situation 6 to 12 months down the line here. So is it that possibility to defer? I already mentioned at the start of this, there's at least one employer we know of that's already deferred their September intake into January, when they believe the business will be in a much better shape to bring that intake in. So is that an option you can look at closely? And then also, is it, if you are going to defer candidates, or if you do have to rescind offers, actually what incentives or compensations can you offer to candidates who might be affected? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of the slides to come. Having worked through similar sort of recessionary periods, there are mistakes that employers do make, and often that comes from actually it's the planning process. It's, yes, having to deal with the immediate crisis, the immediate reality of what's happening in the organization, but actually it's also having a little bit of an eye on what the recovery will look like. At the moment, when we talk to economists, the investor community, what they are predicting at the moment is what they're calling a V-shaped recession, which means there will be a recession, and it will be quite deep, and will happen quite quickly. Well, I think it is happening. I think that's fair to say. But actually, at the moment, what people are thinking is there will be a fairly sharp recovery. If you actually think back to January, there were some signs that there was a post-election bounce. And actually, if you think about the levels of stimulus that the governments are putting into place, or those billions that are being pumped into the economy to help shore up the economy, actually, as we come out of recession, they could have a pretty strong impact. So we could get back into recovery phase pretty quickly. And this is the key thing about resource planning, because I know from my own experiences that organisations that cut too deep with their graduate numbers, actually, as organisations start to recover, that's when you need those people in your labour force. So, a lot of my background was recruiting accountants who were on a 3-year training qualification cycle. Well, actually, if in 3 years' time you haven't kept the investment in people now, when you've got a more buoyant economy, actually you won't have those people qualifying, moving into those more managerial positions, actually the people that can be very much winning business, delivering business, and taking advantage of a resurgent economy. And we've definitely seen businesses suffer because of that. Because one of the problems is taking a short-term decision to excessively cut now. If other employers all do the same, well, actually that trained labour force isn't out there in the marketplace. Or even if it is, if there's fewer of them, actually what you find at that point down the line is that they're much more expensive to hire. They're at a premium, so you've got to go into the open market to find them, so you will pay more for them. And actually, you might not be able to bring in the same level of quality that you would have if you'd actually, still kept your investment and trained your people coming through. So that's corporate knowledge, that's understanding, fitting into an organizational culture, a whole range of different factors that come into play. So it is, yes, this is our advice, is you have to deal with the here and now. So, if you're in a business that's having to put people on furlough, is facing redundancies, well, actually, the idea of still bringing in fresh talent can sound counterintuitive, but we know the organisations that have got that balance right have actually been the stronger businesses as we get into that recovery phase. So I'm sure there's a whole range of different sectors here on this call, a whole range of different industries, and your own circumstances will be different. But that long-term resource planning and thinking is really important. Dealing with a crisis like this sucks up an awful lot of energy, and a lot of immediate decisions need to be making. But if you can carve out just a little bit of headspace just to think about the future, actually that will help you recover more quickly. So some of the things that employers did in the financial crash, I thought it might be useful to share some of those, because it might give you an idea of actually what some of the steps that you might be able to take within your organisation now if you've got this pressure on hiring numbers. So I've said this already, are those business areas actually that identify the business areas that may no longer need graduates, but actually are those areas that actually might want graduates or apprentices, and you can bring those into the business, even if it's just a shorter term opportunity, to move surplus candidates around. I think when you're looking at this work, it's really important to formulate a plan across all business units affected. So again, calling back on my experience, we had a number of different business units hiring graduates. We got a full picture of actually what was happening in each business, and we're able to formulate a plan across all the business units affected. And this is really key. It's getting that leadership agreement. So actually a leadership that can say, right, this is our total resource. This is actually what we want to do with them. So it might be deferring some candidates, but offering other candidates alternative entry points into the business, or maybe offering them a choice between both. But I think that leadership is really important, because they're the ones that in effect can make sure it's implemented. So it might be a question of coercing business units that may say, well, I don't want somebody from that business. I want to go and keep hiring my own people. Actually, that's where you need the leaders to say no, for the good of the organisation. Actually, this is how we're going to implement it. So really important to do that right across the business. If you are in a situation where you need to defer some candidates onto a later start date, or worst case scenarios need to rescind some offers, it's quite important from a HR practice point of view to actually some way of doing that fairly, deciding who's going to be affected. So mechanisms that employers have used in the past have been actually ranking people by assessment centre scores, or doing it by timing of the offer, or anything other that's appropriate for your organisation, but making sure it's fair about how that process is done and is equitable. We saw this in the financial crash. Compensation packages offered to candidates affected, and this can look quite different from sector to sector. Some of it is driven by actually the kind of the level of compensation packages, salary packages that are available in some sectors to another. But often what we saw employers do was actually make one payment to a candidate when they were being deferred, but actually another payment actually made when that candidate joined. So that's encouraging candidates to, yes, take the deferral, but also actually to come back in 6 months, a year's time when they need to. So stuff around that. And then I'm going to come on to this next, the whole communication process. So again, employers dealing with this actually having in place really good communication strategy and making sure that all students are communicated with in the same way, and ensuring that managers, key managers involved in the process are the ones making those calls. But I'll come on to that in a bit more now about that communication piece, because how you communicate these decisions to those affected is really important, both internally and externally. And I say this, I don't want to be too scaremongering, but this stuff does make the press. Stories around what happens to individuals. It's the kind of thing that papers like to report on when they're covering these kind of stories. So at the moment, from our perspective, there isn't much talk in the press about the student job market at the moment. There's a lot in the trade press. So actually we're dealing with a lot of trade press queries at the moment, but we think that maybe in a few weeks' time, the graduate job market will start to make the press. And please don't make the mistake of thinking that the kind of stories in your organisations are the kind of things that will be newsworthy. If you handle this badly, you just don't know who the students that are affected that you're dealing with, you don't know who they know, i.e. their parents might know journalists. That's kind of how stories is. And also the other point on this is actually the impact on your organizational brand with this, as in actually those who are affected, their parents may be clients. There's a whole bunch of different ways this could affect you. And we do know this, like I say, from previous, I won't name names, but in previous downturns, employers that have handled this badly, it has impacted their overall brands, particularly their graduate recruitment brands. And actually they've struggled when the upturn comes and wanting to be back out there in the market and get the best available talent. So we've got 8 top tips here for how you do communicate this activity. So the first thing to say is really communicate early. And actually over communicate, I think, is a good piece of advice. Even if you have nothing concrete to say, there's nothing worse in a vacuum, because people often will assume the worst if that's the case. So just by actually communicating with your candidates, saying you may not have all the answers yet, but you are working on them, and giving them a timescale will at least allay some of those concerns. I think the other thing is about being honest and transparent. So if you have got bad news to give candidates or difficult decisions, that honesty is important. I actually have done this. I've sat in an office and had to phone candidates and tell them that their role was being deferred and they couldn't start as they thought they would be doing, a couple of months' time away. And actually what surprised me at that time was, by following this process properly, is actually the candidates actually were very understanding. And we've heard this from employers already who are saying when they've been communicating decisions around internships, actually what those candidates are saying, well, that's kind of what we expected. Thanks for letting us know, and also very appreciative of anything you're putting in place. And the other key thing to say is don't overpromise. And I have put in here an example. This was the .com crash. There was one rather well-known organization who initially said to its incoming cohort, if you defer for a year, we will give you some financial compensation. The problem they had was that no student actually accepted that offer. So what they then did was they then just cancelled the whole intake by email. Not surprisingly, that made the national press and actually caused quite a bit of fallout for that particular organisation. So I think it's being very careful around what you are promising and making sure that you are going to deliver on that to students. I think the other key thing to say here is use the telephone. I know in these days of email, everything being virtual, we forget this sometimes. So when you're communicating with a group of students, it's important that you have a communications plan. And by that I mean, if there's a point in time where you do want to talk to a particular cohort, actually using multiple channels to get to those students, because you often find there are problems with home addresses, term time addresses, student emails, personal emails. So actually what I found in the past, that actually what you're best to do is to hit a number of channels at one point. So actually send the email, send the letter, and also make the phone call. So you will use all those tools to get in touch with people. And in your written communications, actually say, we are trying to get hold of you to talk to you on the telephone. So please call us back and make an appointment, etc., etc. So I think it's very important that you do use still verbal communication. The other key in this is actually creating a script, because if you've got a particularly large number of students that need dealing with, and there are multiple people who will be making those calls, it's important that actually everybody gets the key facts right. particularly if there's a range of different options for students, and gets those messages out correctly to those students. Because we all know it's really easy when you're in the middle of a telephone conversation, sometimes that conversation can go off at a whole range of different tangents. Put the phone down, you think, damn, I meant to cover that piece and I didn't. So it's very important just to have a script to make sure that the key points are covered, because that's also fair to your students. It means that they will all get the required information that they need. I think it's also important that you use more senior people with this, people who've got experience of maybe having difficult conversations, maybe people at manager level, people who might be used to giving feedback to students after assessment processes, for example. And ideally, again, it depends on the numbers of students you're dealing with, if you can keep that small pool, that pool of people relatively tight, because it's easier to be consistent with messages and also get feedback. If there's a common question coming from candidates or a common concern, actually you're more likely to get that feedback quicker. When I've had to do this in the past, I've actually used people within the HR team to do it rather than the business units to do it, because actually that's been, again, a better way of ensuring those conversations are done properly. Of course, offering calls from the business, as a follow-up, that's perfectly fine and that's a good thing to do, but keeping that pool sort of small and tight. The other key thing when communicating effectively is actually to think like the students. Put yourself in the place of the people that you are talking to. What are the key questions they're going to have? What are the messages they're going to want to hear? What are their key concerns going to be? And then also this 8th point, keep communicating. Once you've said something once and got the original comms out there, actually you're going to need to keep communicating with those people, particularly, let's say, if you're deferring people who are going to come back later in the stage, or you're offering them the opportunity to re-engage with the selection process a little bit later. Keep those communication channels open, and don't forget about those students. And my final point on this is, following all these points is, if you do have to do this, if you do it properly, you'll be surprised how understanding students are. As I said, they read the press. Students, sort of family and friends will be going through similar experiences, so they'll be getting that advice. So as long as you do this properly, actually, in a difficult time, actually, it can be shown that you are a responsive and responsible employer. So 4 key principles for actually managing this properly: treat your students fairly. If you have to make tough decisions for your organisation, it's not saying that we're not recommending that you ignore those realities. There are some very difficult decisions that organisations are having to make at the moment, but you can still treat people fairly and equitably. Consider moving recruitment processes, internships, induction and development programs online. As I said, we know employers who are actually bringing in their spring intakes at the moment, and they're finding ways to navigate around that. That points around the long-term implications of your strategies. Again, it can be difficult. I recognise that when you're in the heat of crisis management, but have that eye on the future. And I think if you've got people in your business that you can call on that were in the organisation, in that 2008-2009 period, get them involved in the decision making. Ask them about any mistakes that were made and what those longer term implications are, because they'll help you to develop the right strategies. And of course, don't ignore the communication piece. Communicate clearly, communicate frequently. I think actually in this time it's better to over communicate rather than under communicate, and that's both internal and external. So just a couple of slides to finish off with, and I mentioned, of course, we've still got some time for some questions at the end. One of the questions we've been asked is, what are the long-term implications on the graduate market? So the image you're looking at is something that Tristram collated actually when he was thinking about the impact of Brexit. So this was looking at the impact of the financial crash. So yes, in 2008-9, there was a drop in the number of graduate vacancies. In that year, according to the old AGR data, there was a drop of about 25% in graduate roles. But you'll see that drop was not as significant actually as those of us working through at the time might have thought, and it did start to recover in the longer term. As I said, some of the predictions at the moment are that there will be a pretty sharp recovery. So actually, I think you need to be careful that you don't find yourself scrabbling around for student hires 6 months to 12 months down the line, and actually when other employers are also out there and giving yourself some real resourcing problems in your organisation. But of course, the other thing I will say is, although that graph paints a relatively positive image about graduate vacancies, what we can't ignore are there's a difference between overall market data and the lived experience of individuals. So there are obviously individuals that will go through quite an uncertain time when it comes to their jobs over the coming months. I mentioned some initial tools. So all the stuff I covered today, plus more, is captured in this employer's guide, which is on our website. Went up there this morning. We're doing a whole range of webinars and events. We're doing pretty much 2 webinars a week, 1 podcast a week. We've got employer town halls. We've got other employer webinars based sector by sector. So there's a whole range of stuff coming out that we really ramped up the kind of stuff we're making available for you. So please make use of that. I mentioned some of the previous webinars. This one will be included. They're all available online. Previous webinar recordings, so you can go back, cover anything that we've missed, or you can share those amongst your team with other people. We have a whole range of podcasts that are out there. The podcast that we did last week featured Vanessa Soames and Bob Atwell, and actually that podcast was a lot of it was about the issues we've been talking about. It was how you manage, student recruitment and development during a crisis. So have a listen of that. Every Monday we put out a weekly COVID-19 bulletin. The 2 newsletters you get from a week. Today you get the Engage bit, which is all about the various events and things that you can hook into. Thursdays is Insights, and that's more about all the content and news that's out there. Some of you will be involved in our WhatsApp group, so there's lots of COVID-19 conversations happening there. We've also got on the members area of our website a discussion forum where you can engage in conversations there, and again that's controlled by IDs and your login details, so you know that it's a secure place to have those conversations. And coming out tomorrow, we'll have the next edition of Student Employer magazine, which we're delivering online, because obviously the majority of people won't be at their desk to receive it. So we were able to get some coronavirus content into there as well, so you'll get plenty of advice and guidance in that as well as all the business as usual stuff. So obviously the coronavirus is dominating the headlines at the moment, but of course business as usual is happening in a lot of places, so we've also keeping that content going. And the final point on that slide in front of you is, do all your teams have access to the members area on the website? We changed the membership structure 2 years ago, so instead of it being just down to one individual, actually anybody in your organisation can have membership access. So if you want to increase the number of people in your teams that have that access, if you're the main contact, you can do that yourself, but if not, get in touch with us at the ISE team and we will factor that out for you. So that was everything that I wanted to cover. I'm just going to have a quick look at the questions box now to see if we've had any questions come through. So let me just pull that out. So if you have got any questions that spring to mind, just feel free to pop them in there. So just bear with me about some of the questions. So the first question on here is, what are my thoughts on offering short-term remote working jobs, possibly unpaid, taking into account it may be flexible working or part-time? So yeah, I think that when it comes to talking to students, actually, if you go back to the financial crash, actually what we were able to say was do things like go traveling, look at alternative jobs. A lot of those options aren't available in the immediate here and now. They might be in months to come, but it's very difficult to say. But yes, anything that helps students get some good experience to keep themselves sort of in the job market, they're the ones who are going to come out of this more quickly and better. So anything that we can get them to offer to do that, I think will be good. There's the whole NHS volunteering stuff that's out there at the moment, and lots of people are offering to do that. So I think there's a whole bunch of opportunities. And of course, we've talked a little bit about those employers suffering a negative impact, but one of the retailers in our retail group, I was talking to them on Monday last week. They'd had to recruit 5,000 people the previous week. So there are sectors that have got real resourcing needs. So I think it's important to get those messages out. A comment from James about success stories, online exercises. Yeah, we're on that, James. I hope to have something on that over the next week or two. I had a conversation this morning about a webinar for next week that possibly might do this, or it might be the week after. But definitely we want to get those stories out to let you know how employers are doing it. Those employers that have done it quickly have been using things like Zoom and other tools and adapting their current exercises to be delivered in that online process. So I think there have been sort of teething problems, as you'd expect, but like I said, we know of employers that have got right through to that offer stage. So we want to bring you some more of that. Do we know of any talks giving careers talks on Zoom? So we haven't got there yet, but we know there are lots of employers who are ramping up their online activities, and there are we want to start collating some of this information, and I know that some of the job boards type third parties out there are starting to promote some of this stuff. So very much keep an eye out for it, and if we find anything, we will look to do that. So a comment from Lucy up in Edinburgh. Yeah, thanks for that. So in terms of group work online, universities, a lot of us have done this for a while. I can share that experience. That'll be great. So Lucy, perhaps you can give me a call afterwards, and we can find a way to get that information through. We've got a town hall call that we do with universities every week at the moment. So I want to get more of that information coming this way, because I think you've got great experience that employers can use quickly. A comment here around Zoom and privacy issues. Zoom have, I think, this week changed their privacy. So they are, I think they're putting passwords in place for every Zoom meeting. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. We've also heard from some government employers that they're not allowed to use Zoom. So actually there are employers out there using tools like Teams, Microsoft Teams, that can work. The software we've got here, although this is webinar software, actually we use this to host meetings sometimes and also record podcasts. So there are other tools out there. But yes, I do think there is a bit of a problem with Zoom for some organisations. But I do know they are ramping up their security in response. A question from Michael. Yes, do we know of how many student recruitment and development pressures have been put on furlough? We don't know yet, but we know it is starting to happen to some people, but we don't quite know the numbers. That's something we want to ask more about over the coming weeks, and also, we're your members organisation, so actually if the job market does get hit, that will impact our members and their own jobs. So what the AGR did in the financial crash was actually offer their platforms and their contacts for actually for people who are recruiting and people who were available. So we will very much look to do that. And then a question here from Andrew. Will this presentation be shared following the webinar? Yeah, absolutely. So we'll put the presentation slides online and also the actual recording of the webinar that you will be able to see. Question here. Well, this isn't a question, this is a comment actually from Amy. Agree with this, Amy. Yeah, communicating early and often with placement students, even if you can no longer take them, because they might be able to find something else if they're given enough warning. And Amy's talking to you about an employer that's come offering a placement for somebody that's been let down. So yeah, reiterate that. Really do, I can't emphasize that enough. Get the communication piece right, because it will at a very practical level, it helps your employer brand. It will help you back in the marketplace, but also helps you deal with, these students who are dealing with individuals in a difficult time. Just scrolling down the questions, there's quite a few more questions coming through here. So some comments here around actually students and the online process. I think this is something this is why we want to get some guides out on how to do the online process properly, because people are doing things at pace. They're having to learn very quickly, and of course that does sometimes make things rough around the edges. So actually it's giving the tools for students to be able to actually deal with these different ways of assessment, and I definitely know one or two people who are pulling together guides at the moment to get out there, so I think we'll see some of that coming out in the next couple of weeks. An area I can't actually say much on because I'm not hearing any solutions yet, but I think they're going to come quite quickly, and that is actually students who may be disproportionately disadvantaged because they come from backgrounds with disadvantage, so i.e. social mobility candidates. We're hearing this in the conversations around what's going to happen with how exams are graded, and I think that's something that we as an industry also need to think about in assessment, so we make sure that people aren't unfairly discriminated again. And a question from Serena around, are some employers making offers without meeting students face to face? Absolutely. So we know some employers who are taking people right through to offer stage and making a full unconditional offer at the end of the assessment centre process. We do know some employers who have moved everything online and are getting to an offer stage, but that's a conditional offer based on the students then coming back to the organisation at a later point, not specifically for another interview or another part of the selection process, but so that both the employer and the individual can make sure that actually there's a good fit, they're right for the organisation, and that everything that's been kind of discussed online actually can be discussed in a face-to-face. So we're hearing both of those as options. And a final comment, we're just over the hour, and I can see people starting to drop off on the attendees, which means people probably have other calls to jump onto, and that is from Anna. And remembering our Asian counterparts. Absolutely, Anna. We've got a couple of sessions in the pipeline from organisations that actually have been working over in Asia Pac, because of course some of those countries have been through this whole dreadful period earlier and are coming out of it, so there's lots of earlier learnings that we can use from that. I had a conversation with Ben, who does the same job as me but for AAG in Australia, and we were talking there about sharing information, how we can learn from some of Ben's members, and actually Australia's not had a recession for 28 years, so they're facing that at the moment. So actually are there also learnings that we can share over there? So very much want to keep that international conversation going. So thank you for all participation. Like I say, we've crammed an awful lot into actually what's just over an hour and 5 minutes. Please keep on the lookout for more content. As I said, we're really ramping up the content that we provide to you in this difficult time. If there's anything that we've not covered that you'll find really useful, please drop me an email. We'll factor it into our plans. Or if there's anything that you would like to share, particularly from employers, around actually things you're finding that have worked, I think it'd be great if we can use that information to help other employers. Then also actually from universities and suppliers, you'll all be dealing with this and coming up with solutions. So we've seen this already, but I'd like to very much keep that going, which is that idea of collaboration and knowledge sharing, because actually it's that kind of thinking that the ISE is very good at bringing together, and will help us deal with this crisis and get through it as best we can. So that's it for now. I'll sign off here. Thank you very much for all your time, and hopefully we'll speak to you all very soon. And please do have a very good Easter, and I hope you and your families stay safe. Thank you.